COVID-19 is something that is a big issue for all of us. How do I go down? Okay, and there's actually an information overload. All of us know this. There's an information overload. There's every journal has now had a site specifically dedicated to COVID, and most of the literature that comes out from COVID is not peer reviewed, nor is it reviewed by anyone, and it just comes under the literature. And we probably don't know whether we should really use it for our day-to-day practice or not, because each of these papers, if you see, has got so many flaws, so many problems, so absence of so much judiciousness in making these papers that I'm not very certain whether we can use most of the things that come in Lancet or rather even NEJM for that matter. It's a very, very big issue with literature as of now in COVID-19 because of the global pandemic. They are not able to peer review it, and they feel we should probably share most of the research, but that's what the problem is all about. So as of now, there are so many clinical trials. There are, a truckload of trials coming in non-pharmaceutical treatment of COVID, pharmaceutical treatment, antimicrobial treatment, antiviral treatment, local treatment. If you look at it, there are almost 769 clinical trials as of now that is going on. 769 is a very, very large number for a single disease. A single disease having 769 trials is actually a very, very large number. Normally don't have so many trials in such a short time, 3 months, and 769 trials going on, 2 into prevention arms, 1,600 treatment arms, and 15 post-treatment arms. This is a very large number. It's this most hot thing happening in research. I mean, everyone is doing some research on the other on COVID-19 because we are waiting for a lot of answers to most of our questions. In fact, we are barely getting any questions answered as of now. As of now, that is an issue. That's a big issue that's happening. So if you look at it, this is the registration that's going on right from February onwards to May 31st. And April has seen a large number of trials being recruited into into this. And the whole world, actually, if you look at it, USA, China, Iran, India, even India is having a large number of trials, that is Spain, France, Europe. So there are many number of trials that are coming in on various topics. Now, this is just a sample number of trials that are going on. But if you look at the graph on disease severity, so look at it, maximum trials are going on in the moderate, severe, critical, and some amount in the severe critical. It's probably related to the fact that critical and severe critical patients die so much that they are unable to even recruit them into the arms. So that's the reason that when you look at moderate to severe, severe to critical, severe critical and critical have barely any trials coming in. Barely any trials coming in. That's probably because these patients are dying so quickly in these particular places, and doing a trial is becoming a very difficult problem. Doing a trial in such patients, because you just can't not offer a certain kind of therapy and then offer a certain kind of therapy to somebody else because patients are just dying. So, so compared to the mild, moderate, and moderate severe, these trials are really lacking. And if you look at the spectrum of medicines, or for that matter, drugs that they're trialing, there's antiviral, monoclonal, non-specific antivirals, antibiotics, ACE inhibitors. The whole world is doing so much of research. And if you look at it, these are the trials evaluating pharmacological treatments over time. The severe critical arm, the trials are much lesser compared to moderate, severe, mild, moderate, and no restriction. So as of now, if you ask me, do I know something is working? I would probably say no, because trials are still going on. So there's too many trials going on, and there are too many questions and there's less answers that we have. Too many questions, very less answers. The scene is extremely bad today. We all know, people sitting in Bombay, that what we are reading in the newspapers and what's actually happening is much different. We have a large amount of cases that are coming in, and really speaking, the suburbs are now in a big issue. As per today's my talk with the BMC people, the suburbs are having a lot of COVID as compared to south of Bombay and Dharavi onwards. Dharavi is seeing very less cases, probably because of the migration that has occurred, whereas the suburbs are basically feeling the brunt as of now. It has now reached Palghar, Virar, which was one place which is kind of untouched for quite some time. A slump of cases, including Dombivli, Kalyan. Dombivli is now badly affected. Probably all of you would have got the message of Milind Bairagi. Every one of you would have got the message of Milind Bairagi, which has gone viral about a doctor who was told to work in spite of by the government, and he passed away in my ICU recently. So the coronavirus is something that is a big issue. So we bottom will do going to touch a little bit symptoms, a little bit, just a little bit symptoms. We all know symptoms, but we still want to touch a little bit. We'll talk about issues that are there, and I'll give a little bit of my experience of what's happening in this. So when coronavirus came in for the first 1 month, even now I feel, God, what is this? It's a big issue as of now. What we know for certain is that it comes from a family. called as orthocoronavirus. This is for certain. We know this. That comes from orthocoronavirus. It's got 4 family members, alpha, beta, delta, and gamma. And it's come from a small area called as Wuhan in China, from the Hubei province. And beta viruses, that is the beta group, is the one that causes most of the issue, whereas the rest, the alpha lineage causes common cold, etc. But the beta lineage is the one of a problem. That is the SARS-CoV, the MERS-CoV, and the SARS-CoV-2. So it's a B lineage that has been a big problem for the orthocoronavirus family. What we know a little bit about viral shedding is there's almost 2 days of pre-symptomatic phase. I mean, before you get the symptoms, there are at least 2 to 2.5 days where the virus will shed in spite of having no symptoms, and that's the problem. This is the difference between H1N1 and SARS-CoV-2 that we are facing. In H1N1, you started shedding, you started getting infective right from the time you were symptomatologically seen yourself as having cold, cough, or fever. But in this cases, you are having 2 or 2.5 days of pre-symptomatic period. That means even before the symptoms have come, you've started shedding the virus. That's the reason that the social contact becomes a big issue. So just it's not this way that only if a person cough, he's going to probably spread it. By new emerging evidence. It does look like there is also some kind of airborne spread. So the pre-symptomatic period now becomes even more important, because it probably, those are the guys who are going to spread. The local grosso probably may have it, may end up spreading it to a lot of us. The average time that it remains in the body is somewhere around 9 to 10 days, beyond which the infectivity goes down majorly. So if a person has reasonably been affected for a period of around 10 to 12 days, we can reasonably assume that his infectivity is much lower once he crosses around 10 days to 11 days. That's what it is. That's what most of the studies say. So these are the few things that we understand about the virus. But there's a large number of things that we don't understand about it. First of all, these symptoms. I mean, every other day we hear a new symptom coming in. So we initially started with fever, breathless, and cough. That's what we started with. And then over a period of time, we've got everything possible. We've got sore throat, we've got anosmia, we've got dysphagia, we've got GI upset, we've got encephalopathy, we've got diarrhea. I mean, we have every symptom in the book that's coming out. Every symptom in the book. So you can't really, get one symptom and say this is how COVID is going to present. There is a large number of symptoms. In fact, the other day we had a patient just with anosmia, nothing more than anosmia. Nothing more than anosmia. Patient just came and said we have anosmia, nothing more than that. Third day patient went into ARDS, and 4th day patient was in cytokine storm. So it's like you don't need to have fever, cough, breathlessness to get into an ARDS. You can just have anosmia, and 3-4 days later you can get into a problem. That's how it looks like. So initially it was the Chinese who basically taught us the disease. Then came the Italians, and then came the rest of the world. So when Chinese actually showed their Wuhan experience, so they actually reported fever being one of the highest symptoms, followed by cough and then dyspnea. This is what they basically said. So cough, dyspnea, nausea, vomiting, they kept saying about this. So when New York came, when this happened in New York, they also reported fever, cough as very common, along with dyspnea, and they included myalgia. So that's how myalgia comes in. So when New York had somewhere in the month of April. But then came big editorials on COVID-19, and they found out that patients may have fewer, actually no symptoms. Even a mild pneumonia, which is probably not having very high fevers, may also present COVID. And in fact, they had a large number of patients with taste and olfactory disorders, which is almost 53%. I mean, 53% means 1 in 2. 1 in 2 will have taste and olfactory problems. So it's crazy. Another thing that was also there in 32% of cases was ocular manifestations, conjunctival hyperemia, chemosis. The other day, when Dr. Avisha told me that she sees so much of chemosis, she's right. I mean, it's around 40%. That means 1 in 3 cases. 1 in 3 cases would present with just ocular manifestations, which is conjunctival hyperemia, chemosis, and increased secretions. So this makes the entire ball game very difficult. The other day, my child came to me telling me that, Dad, my eyes have become red. I was petrified. When you know more of something, you start getting scared more and more. So I was kind of petrified because, we are working in our COVID setups. We get back, we don't know what we're doing to our children. So, so when I hear about ocular manifestations, it's something else. Another thing that is very common, and we know 50% of cases have, is myocarditis. So myocarditis is something that is very regularly seen in our ICUs. I mean, patient comes in, and we really don't know why he's hypotensive, and how can a third day patient get secondarily infected. So it turns out to be myocarditis, and because of the absence of doing ultrasounds very often, we kind of miss out many of these things. See, we go in once, we have a point of care. We are like now at blood gas. All our intensive care doctors are like blood gas meters. We go inside once and we come out. We're not like pulse ox. Pulse ox is a continuous monitoring, whereas a blood gas is a point estimate at a certain point. So we've all become point estimates. We are not really going inside like how we used to do. Before, initially we used to remain in the ICU for a long period of time, and we used to pick up problems quickly. But now we are unable to do that because it's mostly based on camera and what we get feedback from our registrars who have been repurposed. They are really not registrars. They are ICU RMOs. ICU RMOs have been repurposed as registrars. Registrars have been repurposed as clinical associates. Clinical associates have become JCs. So they're really not well equipped to do the stuff, but they are doing it. That's how it is. We've got respiratory therapists doubling up into the ICU as some kind of doctor. So it's all a big problem as of now. So when we chronicled we have chronicled this. Our study came out, some recent data came out. We also found the same thing. We found large number of patients with fever, and most of the ICU patients that we had cough and shortness of breath. So two things that we had commonly in the whole study was cough and shortness of breath, which was seen in ICU patients, and 1 on 2 had one of these symptoms. So we never had patients without these symptoms in our ICU, at least. In our ICU, we had the same fever, cough, and breathlessness. This also might be because of the fact that we screened them this way when they entered our hospital. So what we're also noticing is these patients, I mean, the first patient that I had in COVID was an eye-opener for me. I was startled at how he was. So my doctor kept calling me, and I was somewhere else taking a lecture, and he kept calling me saying that, sir, a patient aaya hai, saturation is 85, 84, and he's breathing at a rate of 50. And he kept calling me and saying, sir, isko intubate karna padega, intubate karna padega, intubate karna padega. I was, and I kept, and then, you know, when I told him, asked him how is he feeling, and the patient used to say, I'm fine. Patient used to say, I'm fine. I'm a respirator of 45. Anyone would have gone and intubated. We don't want to hear anything more. 45 is an intubation, clear-cut intubation. But then I came back from my lecture, and I saw this patient, and my registrar was deciding to keep everything ready for intubation, so he kept his intubation cart ready and stuff like that. I entered the cubicle, and this guy was standing on besides the bed and passing urine. I mean, this is what COVID taught me. I mean, there can be diseases this way, which completely defies logic. It completely defies logic. How can a person breathing at a respirator of 55 or 50 with a saturation of 85 stand bedside and pass urine? It's something that's unheard of. It's unheard of. His pulse rate, his blood pressure was completely normal, and he didn't complain. He was not complaining of anything. So this is what we call something called as happy hypoxia. So, you know, I do a lot of lung estimates by doing compliances and resistances. This I don't think anybody does in India. I also find out dead spaces and things like that by objective methods, by nitrogen washout and things like that. So I did find the compliance and resistance in some patients were okay, but that was not the case. As we go ahead, I'll teach you about, I'll explain to you what I'm seeing in patients over here. So this was what was told to us. When COVID came in, this was what was told to us. They said compliance and resistances are generally okay, dead space is just okay, and they have a shunt. So what did I do? I started looking at our patients. So this is one of the few patients. This is way back on 24th May when I was studying the lungs of these patients. I found out that their FRCs were quite low. The functional residual capacity is like the reserve tank of your car. So the reserve tank in their body was quite low. It was somewhere around 600, 800. Sometimes it's around 400. And then you need recruitment. Initially, we were told, when we were taught by Gattinoni. Gattinoni is a very famous man in critical care. He looks at lungs only. So Gattinoni told the world that, you know, recruitment is something that we shouldn't do in these patients, and these patients might die. Now, this what I'm showing you is an image of a ventilator where I'm doing something called as an FRC maneuver. I'm doing a functional residual capacity maneuver to find out whether I can increase the amount of lung that this patient has. So if you look at the figure on 1137, that's 1135. That was his lung functional residual capacity. And then when I recruited him, if you see the peep down there, it's 18, 18, 24, 30. See, I got to 30 peeps. And when I went to 30 peeps, very clearly I'm seeing the FRC to increase from 1135 to 1620. That's almost a 400 ml of rise. I mean, 400 ml of rise is a large amount of oxygen that this patient will probably get. So I have actually improved the volume of the lungs without harming it. Why am I not harming it? Because I'm actually looking at it very carefully. I'm looking at all these figures. So see the peep over here on this patient. This patient's peep is 30. So this defies logic. This defies logic. This is what Gattinoni told us, don't give peep. But I've started giving peep to most of our patients, especially because I'm doing something called as esophageal manometry. I'm actually putting a catheter. These are all high-end devices. I'm putting a catheter into the esophagus in order to understand what is the pressure I'm giving onto the lungs. See, if you exceed the pressure onto the lungs, that's when the lungs will rupture. That's when you'll have barotrauma. There's not things like that. But what I'm doing is I'm monitoring them so that there is no barotrauma, there is no lung issues. So I'm looking at something called as strain and transpulmonary pressure, and I keep them in the reference ranges. So when I keep them in reference ranges, I have the benefit of increasing the PEEP very protectively. So we end up giving very, very high PEEPs, though the peak pressures over here is 70. Peak pressures are the pressures, the peak pressure over there is almost nearing 70. When you have very high peak pressures, we normally assume that this patient's airways occluded, but this is not the case because the PEEP itself is 30 over here. So this is another case. If you look at this, 1,100 gone up to 1,452, another 300 ml of rise, and a PEEP going from somewhere around 14 to 18. So I mean, yes, this is how we are doing in most of our cases. We are actually monitoring the functional residual capacity and thus taking care of the PEEPs. So what you're seeing over here is a graph that you'd probably not see in any hospital in India. What we're seeing down there, the third graph, is the esophageal pressure. And if you look at the 18, 15, and 22, this is P-ox, means the esophageal pressure. If I maintain the esophageal pressure, whatever PEEP I'm going to give will probably be protective. And that's the reason that we are one of the only centers doing recruitment maneuvers to these patients. And we've got good data now supporting us that it does work very well. So this was a large amount of critical care for non-ICU doctors. So what are the various so why did I stress on that? I stressed on that because as of now, after this 4 months of practice, I just realized it's nothing but good ventilation that improves them. If you don't give them good ventilation, they will die. It is not the drug. There is no magic drug that will help this patient. There is absolutely no magic drug that will help this patient. There is no drug that even will slightly help this patient, I'll put it this way. But the one thing that can definitely change mortality or change the way these patients are going to do in the future is going to be the lung, how you take care of the lung when they are ventilated. So these are the few investigations that we do on a regular basis. So if anybody will ask me what the WBC does, I do the WBC just to understand what the lymphocyte counts are. Okay, the lymphocyte counts and the neutrophil counts, the NL ratio gives us a fair bit of an estimate as to how severe the disease is. That's why we look at the counts there. Platelets in these cases are never very low. So if you get the platelets less than 1 lakh, you should start wondering that there is something more. Now, when you're coming with malaria, you must understand there the platelet counts will be low. But in COVID, it is very uncharacteristic to have platelet counts less than 1 lakh. If you get it less than 1 lakh, there's something more happening over there. D-dimer, a very overestimated subset of the investigations that are being used live, right, left, center. D-dimer is only going to help you in prognosis, nothing more. It's not going to really help you characteristically to understand whether the patient needs or does not need, or whether the patient needs Clexane, does not want to increase the dose of Clexane, nothing like that. But I'll show you a very interesting case. Though I'm talking about D-dimer not being very good on finding out Clexane, I'll show you one case of what we've done recently. The LDH is another factor which, if it's more than 285, we normally assume that the prognosis is bad. Lactates will be normal. Lactates are not going to be elevated. If your lactates elevated, you're probably dealing with secondary infection. So lactates will come only in secondary infection. CRP will mirror the D-dimer and the ferritin levels, and these are all acute phase reactants which will go up if there is something called as a cytokine storm. The SDLT generally does not drive more than 3 times the upper limit of normals. But why do we do that? We do that because we want to rule out other pathologies. Viral fevers can cause other pathologies. So this is a few snapshots of a few patients that we did have. And we look at the D-dimers. The D-dimers have been fairly around the place. Some have gone up in the start, some have gone up towards the end, some have gone up in the midway. But what we're noticing is all those patients who've kind of improved, their D-dimers have slowly come down. Okay, so that is something that is there. The D-dimers do come down. So if you look at this patient who got admitted on the 5th, on 20th Jan, Feb, March, April, May, 20th May to 1 month, 19/6, that is exactly a month later, that is when his D-dimers came down. So his D-dimers otherwise were anywhere between 6 and 7. That's a very large number. 6 and 7 is the normal is 0.25. 6 and 7 is very, very high. So he had this D-dimer of almost 6 and 7 for almost 15 odd days, and that's after that only it started coming down. All right, so this is a very, very large number of D-dimer in this entire time, but it did come down towards the end, and he's gone home very well. That's how these patients are. Now look at this. This is what the D-dimer looks like. What's very interesting is the lymphocyte count remains on the lower side till the patient starts improving. So this is something that we're seeing in most of our patients. If the lymphocyte count starts taking off, if the lymphocyte count starts going up, you can reasonably assume that this patient is now probably going to recover. I'm not certain about it, but most of the studies that I'm doing, it looks like once the lymphocytes count starts going up, there seems to be a trend. There seems to be a trend that this patient will improve, and that mirrors a D-dimer going down. So I don't know what to read from this, but yes, we are looking at that in our ICU. We look at the lymphocytes going up, and we try pacifying ourselves that probably this patient will probably improve. This is another investigation that is regularly being done, interleukin 6. So if the interleukin 6 has a rapid rise, that's when we are worried. If it has got a rapid rise, it probably indicates something called as the cytokine storm or a hyperinflammatory state. It is this stage at which we can probably try using certain anti-inflammatory molecules. So following up the interleukin 6, especially at the day 8, day 9, day 10, day 11 is very, very important, because if there's a huge step up, you may want to consider using drugs that will reduce the inflammation. Another thing that we're looking at is also fibrinogen. So if the fibrinogen is very high, you can assume that in the next 1 or 2 days, the interleukin is going to go high, because after all, the fibrinogen and interleukin go hand in hand. So if the fibrinogen is very, very high, means you are probably going into a clotting phase. And if the fibrinogen goes very, very low, then probably this patient is going to die. There are two things that you can read from the fibrinogen. If the fibrinogen goes very, very low, he's probably going to die. So that's about the fibrinogen. So we are also doing something called as TEG, thromboelastogram. So we do it for all our patients in order to understand coagulation, because D-dimer is not leading us to anywhere. PTINR and PTT is not leading us to anywhere. That's why we attempted doing the TEG values. And what we found out is those patients who kind of improved, the clotting index does go down. So in 2019, as part of the Lancet group, in fact, Lancet Oncology too, in the guidelines for DVT prophylaxis for cancer patients. So that time I was given this part. So this part was, when you write guidelines, there are you're given a certain part that you have to research on of 150 papers, and then you come to a conclusion with a group of authors. So I was given this part, and what I told at that time was we have to use the highest prophylactic dose of LMWH to prevent post-operative VT in cancer patients. This is what we recommended. This is not very far off. This is in December. In December, we recommended this for oncology patients. And we also said that if the platelet count is more than 50, we still can use full dose of anticoagulation. What I knew that COVID will come in. COVID has come and changed everything. The highest prophylactic dose has changed. Initially, our highest prophylactic dose was 0.6. That has also changed to 0.8. Thrombopenia, we are now giving Clexane even for patients whose platelet counts are 25,000. So, I mean, COVID-19 has taught us a completely different story. Now, this is what it looks like. So, this is what the TEG report looks like. In the TEG report, we have a certain 3-4 things that we look at. One is the R value, the K value, and the angles. So, there is an R value and the K value. The R value and K values are low, angles are high. We normally consider this patient to have a very high hypercoagulable state, irrespective of the D-dimers. The D-dimers would be like working like an acute phase reactant, will not really tell you about clotting, but TEG reports will tell you about the strength of the clot. It will tell you how quickly it's going to clot, whether there is going to be lysis, whether there is secondary fibrinolysis, are you overdoing your stuff? All this will be told to us. So this is the picture of this patient. The D-dimer was 3.2, LDH was 520, ferritin was 3000, and it was clearly evident on the TEG report that the patient was hypercoagulable. Well, that's the curve that is coming. This is the curve. The curve that you see in dotted lines is the normal patient. And this curve is the abnormal patient. So the TEG report gives us a curve, and this curve is completely changed. So most of our patients are following the red lines. So TEG reports seem to be much better. And there is one study that has looked at TEG reports with a very small number of patients, 24. As I told you, R values, the K values, the angles, and the fibrinogens is something that they look at. Now, what is this also TEG report told us? That there is some kind of endothelial issue that is occurring, causing a release of von Willebrand factor. So if you actually were to, actually study the von Willebrand factor and ristocetin factor, you probably see it going up. And that's what the ICMR lab at KEM 13th floor is doing. They're actually looking at von Willebrand factor, ristocetin factor, as well as antigen von Willebrand factor to understand whether this is going up in certain patients to understand clotting much better. Well, this is also, if you look at this report, these are a few patients of mine where you see very clearly the R values to be low, the K values to be low as compared to the reference mean, and the angles to be quite high. So in spite of the D-dimers, being normal, you can get a hypercoagulable state. You might be tricked by looking at the D-dimers. That's why the D-dimers are not great markers to understand whether the patient requires anticoagulation or not. Now, this is how most of the CTs look. It's awful. This is the simplest CTs. There's a very simple CT I'll show you. What CTs? If the ICU CTs are extremely bad with completely ground glassing, and we feel these patients are not going to improve at all. So we have three types of lungs. We have pneumonitis lungs, which will not improve, needs prone position. We have atelectasis plus pneumonitis lungs, which will need a combination of recruitment and prone. And we have the ARDS lung, which will require recruitment. So it is important to understand which kind of lung you're dealing with, because one treatment will not work for the other. So there's a lot of things that we do to understand the three types of lungs. So it's not one rule fits all. You can't just use ARDS ventilation for every patient. No, it's not that way. You need to understand what is the lung all about. And there are three different manifestations, and each of those manifestations have got a different treatment. So it's a large amount of work that goes on to save a patient in this case. And the management comes from experience here. I don't think there is any book that will tell you that this is the way it should be done. It's all like my mother makes tea. She makes tea better because she's been using it, making it again and again. She knows how much sugar to add, how much milk to add. So that's how we're learning in COVID too. We're learning out of experience what is to be done. There are a few key issues, and one of the most important issues that we all face is fear. Most issue that we all face is fear. We have the fear of getting into COVID, and it's a very thin rope to walk. I'm still scared to get on this COVID side, and this if you have this fear, then it can lead to large amount of post-traumatic stress at home, stress at workplace, stress everywhere. So the only way to do that is to improve knowledge, to improve how you can protect yourself, to understand how each one can protect somebody else. Not to do it is not something that we will we should do. We should all try to work in it. That is how we'll probably overcome the fear. Do or do not. There is no try. You have to just do it. Either do it or don't do it. There is no I will try. It has to be done. So that's one part of the entire story that we have. So stop thinking about it. Try to become more confident in the way you work and overcome the fears. That's very, very important that we do. And I always say there are 6 P's when we manage these patients. There's the first P that I talk about is be prepared. That's very, very important. Be prepared all the time. Be prepared before you enter, before you start working, and the preparation will. This is the preparation in Raheja. I mean, look at this. This is the intubation card that is always ready on Raheja. So this intubation card has got everything. If you look at it very closely on the left side upper diagram, even the endotracheal tubes are opened up with stillets kept inside. If you look at the IV fluids, they're all open. They're just with caps they've kept inside. Everything is opened up. Everything is ready. This is how it is for our intubation cards, because you really don't have time, because intubation is probably one of the most scariest things to be done in these kind of cases. So we prepare everything to the ventilation circuit. It's all ready. So be prepared. So if you're going for a surgery, be prepared much before. Rehearse it night before. Rehearse. It's very, very important to do that, because last moment if there are problems, it's going to be a catastrophe. It's important to rehearse whatever we're doing. That's very important. The second thing that we think is PPE. Do not work if you don't have PPE. Can't be Robin Hoods. I have not been Robin. I didn't get it from my patient. I'm telling you, my COVID is not from my patient. My COVID has probably come from maybe colleagues, maybe from outside, I'm not certain, but not from my patient for certain, because we wear such beautiful PPEs. We all ensure that we wear impervious gowns, impervious coveralls, and to top about it, I used to also wear a P100. So never and never go into an area without PPE. There is nothing that you're going to achieve without a PPE. You will only cause problems to yourself. So PPE is one of the most important things that is required. The other thing is protocol. Everything needs to be protocoled. Here, you cannot depend on your experience during the during the time of work, because it has to be protocoled. Otherwise, there'll be a problem. There'll be a problem. Protocols, and why you need protocols? Because you don't know who's working inside. It might be the junior most doctor inside. So unless you put a protocol in place, the junior most doctor will not be able to, does not have the experience to understand what is to be done. So there has to be a donning doffing protocol. There has to be a communication protocol. How do you communicate outside? How do you communicate inside? How do you communicate among your people? It's like diving. When you dive inside, you can't talk when you're a diver's suit. You need to communicate by some kind of symbols. Similarly, here also you require a communication protocol, a post-exposure protocol. For example, if inside I was working and I happened to intubate and my coverall broke and my N95 came off, what do I do? Do I just stand there and cry? No, I need to get into a room that is open with positive pressure. I need to have a bath. I need to clean myself. So there has to be a room for post-exposure protocol. Oxygen protocol. How am I going to move my oxygen? Is it going to be from high flow to NRBM to NRBM to NIV, from NIV to whatever helmet? So that protocol has to be in place. Cleaning and disinfection protocol, ventilation protocol, even a simple thing like transfer of lab samples. That also needs a protocol as to how it should go double cover from here to other place, how much time it should take, a medication protocol, an intubation protocol, and most importantly, nutrition protocol. I'm the only one who's probably gained weight in COVID. Everybody else has lost weight. Everybody in COVID has lost weight, including my patients. Of course, they've lost only 2 or 3% of their weight, around 5% maximum we have lost. But I have gained weight. Probably I just followed my nutrition protocol to the core. So nutrition is a very, very important aspect in this kind of viral diseases, which are extremely catabolic in nature. The other thing is to participate. It's important to participate with your people, have peace and love. It's very important to talk to your nurses. The very important thing is to talk to your nurses, talk to your colleagues. Everybody is under stress. Everybody is under stress, stress of everything. So it's important to participate, discuss, and speak to your colleagues, and that will probably nurture teamwork. And this teamwork is the one that's going to help it. This is No one has understood teamwork as much as we understood during COVID. COVID has made us a team. COVID has made us all together. COVID has made us to live like a family. I mean, the nurses, the housekeeping, the doctors, they're all become a family now. It's great to see this happening in India. And this is something that I always wanted to, and it's happened because of COVID-19. Because if you don't do this, there's a huge amount of burnout. I mean, burnout is just too much. I've had a couple of doctors, couple of nurses who have had this burnout, and it has been very catastrophic for them. Some of them have not yet joined in for work. In spite of having so much of work culture, we are having burnouts, and that's the reason that it's important to hear somebody. It's important to be compassionate to the other person. It's very important to empathize among your own colleagues, which never did this. We never did this when we were working. We were all running around doing our stuff, finishing our work, going from place to place. We never did this empathy, this connect. And now we started doing this empathy with our own people, compassion with our own people, connect, listening to their problems. So this is something that we've started doing very regularly. What lies ahead, I don't know. What lies ahead in this future, I really don't know. In COVID-19, and we're taking one day at a time. And every time new evidence comes, we change our protocols. Every time we learn something, we change it. So what lies ahead, none of us will probably know. None of us can predict. None of us can understand what to do in the future. And that is very important, to keep abreast with literature and keep learning it again and again, keep reading again and again, and finding out which literature you should use for your patients. And I think the end result is something like this. I think we probably butchered our earth so badly that it's getting back to us. This is what I feel. It's getting just back to us. This climate, this virus is probably just getting back to us. Michael Jackson, long back, I think in 80s, 90s, actually sang a song called "Heal the World," and it's so important now that even after this COVID will come, COVID will go, but we should all realize that we should not, butcher our Mother Earth, our Earth, and we should start loving Earth and nurturing it to a way that these problems never occur again. So let COVID come, let COVID go, but now henceforth we should probably think of improving our Earth more than anything. Than this. Thank you very much. And anybody who wants to understand more of COVID, you can probably go to my website. There are blogs, there are protocols, all of them free. There is nothing, no money, nothing. I'm just writing it on a alternate day basis as to what to do, what not to do. You just have to register on it, and you get access to everything over here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sanjay. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. I think there are it's very nice. I think Nitin has asked something. Is pneumothorax a common complication for patients on prolonged high flow oxygen and BiPAP?
So, where's Nitin? Is he there?
Nitin is there. Yeah, he's there.
Yeah.
So, Nitin, we are not seeing that. We are not seeing pneumothorax. That's probably because of the fact that we are using so much of esophageal manometry that our lungs are protected. So we know exactly where we are going. If you're using esophageal manometry, you know that increasing PEEP is not harming your lungs. So when we are doing it on real-time basis. So I have not seen a single pneumothorax. If you see the PEEP on that monitor that I showed, it was 30. 30 PEEP. Have you heard of 30 PEEP? Yeah, this is 30 PEEP. So, but the patient has been completely stable, no problem. That patient has gone home. So, we are doing transpulmonary pressure monitoring. Probably no one and now a few centers in Pune, one center in Pune has started. So this ensures that you protect your lung very, very well. So it's expensive, but it's probably worth it. So we are not seeing pneumothorax, no.
Because two of my patients had pneumothorax. One of them was doctor only.
And
later on he was shifted to Bhatia Hospital.
No,
esophageal manometry is not possible in my hospital.
So Sanjay, what's the mortality rate in your ICU?
If you cannot do esophageal manometry, the best thing to do is keep them at a PEEP of 8 to 10 and prone them. Keep them at a PEEP of 8 to 10 and prone them. Don't go higher than 10. To go higher than 10, you will need to understand FRC, you will need to understand what is the pressures inside the extrathoracic compartment, and that will not be possible. So the easiest method is don't worry about the FiO2, let the FiO2 be 100. How much of a time let it be 100, that is not a problem. but you keep the PEEP at somewhere around 10, 8 or 10 and just prone them. If you prone them and extended proning 16 hours for 3 days time, fourth or fifth day they'll become as big flowers. Yeah.
Okay. Sushma is asking you something.
Krishna.
What's your mortality rate?
So, we had around till now we had around 8 deaths till now only. 9 deaths we had. Only 9 deaths. So
Out of how many?
we have more than 100 patients now.
Okay.
More than 200 patients we would have got to. 200 250 patients. More than that.
Okay.
So we average we have a small ICU. We are not increasing the strength.
Acha.
Yeah, we are keeping
Okay.
the ICU somewhere around 12 to 14 beds. We don't want to go more than that. Though I have 30 beds, I am keeping the other beds empty. But we are giving 12 and 14 only so that we can concentrate on those 12, 14 patients. So probably because of that, we probably having less mortality compared to others. And our mortality has been some 2 or 3 doctors. Actually, 4. We have a lot of doctors coming to us. So we lost around 3 doctors till now. 3 doctors we lost.
Oh.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was it's painful to lose 4 doctors. We lost 4 doctors rather. We lost one ENT surgeon, one MD medicine. We lost 2 general physicians. So it was a traumatic experience. It's very trauma. I'm telling you, it's really trauma. When that ENT surgeon, it's my personal thing. When the surgeon actually looked into my eyes and asked me, "Am I going to survive?" It was a very tough thing to tell him. That it's very critical. It's really tough. And he's my colleague. He's my friend. And when he looked into me and told me, am I going to survive? It was a very difficult answer. Believe me, it is very difficult. If your friend is asking you this question, it is very, very difficult. That's how it was. So another physician also asked me. Luckily, he came out of it, and he's doing very, very well. So we had a lot of almost around 15 physicians till now who've done well and gone out. The last patient we lost was day before yesterday. I think probably all read that viral message that came in. Dr. Milind Vairagi or something like that name. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I read about it.
So that was it's gone viral, all that message. So that was the last doctor we lost. We did everything possible, but we just couldn't save him. We just couldn't save him. Yeah. So COVID, that's why I feel is not a disease that will probably help with treatment. Treatment is only 10 or 15%. I think it's more of fate in COVID because sometimes nothing works, sometimes everything works, or it seems like it's working. So I don't know whether it really makes a difference. Yeah.
Right. Because
Sanjit,
Yeah, Akshay.
do you conduct trials plasma therapy in Raija?
So we are doing something very funny. ये बंद करके रखा है क्या? Record मत करना सचिन ये.
Record नहीं करो क्या?
ये segment record मत कर.
So okay, then I'll just pause just a minute.
Yeah, just pause. Okay. So yes, I mean, I don't see a big difference if you ask me for certain. I don't see a big difference, and I'm again telling you and again telling you, it is hypoxia and inflammation more than anything more that is the downfall of these patients. So if you increase the inflammation, the patient will die. If you increase the hypoxia, duration of hypoxia, the patient will die. So some people have this notion, he's stable, 85 pe chhod do. Nahi, even if he's stable, even if he's 85, he's probably causing more harm to himself. You are just not seeing that harm. So it doesn't make sense to accept 85 just because he's stable, because COVID patients are stable at 85 also. So you probably are tricked by COVID. You need to keep that oxygen up, because what happens with hypoxia is it causes a release of Perceptin and TPA and things like that, and then you find D-dimers going up, you find the patient going down. So don't think of hypoxia. Initially we thought if there's hypoxia there'll be anaerobic metabolism and lactates will go up, but this never occurred in these patients. Lactates never go up, indicating very clearly that hypoxia is causing an issue here. So it's rather than that, do not accept hypoxia, do not accept inflammation. And if you do not ventilate these patients well, you are going to get more inflamed. Ventilation causes more problem. We all know ventilation kills patients. So unless you ventilate them well, there will be more inflammation. So proper ventilation is very important. So if you think that, I can't give too much PEEP, don't give. It is better to have more days on the ventilator rather than subjecting the patient to high PEEP and inflammation and complications. Yeah.
So Sanjay, tell me one thing. What is your, how do you start the steroids? What are the indications and for how long?
So see, steroids is another very, very difficult and controversial topic in COVID-19.
Your personal
Yeah. So what
experience.
I am doing is first 4 days no steroids. You know, first 4 days I refrain from giving steroids because the virus is in its replication phase. So at that time, if you try to give steroids, you'll probably let the virus remain for a longer period of time. And more virus means more inflammation because it does get snugly fitted to the ACE2 and causes endothelial apoptosis, causing prothrombotic states. So it's important that we don't push that viral replication for a longer period of time. So see, knowing the duration of illness is very important. So if you're at day 5, day 6, when viral replication is reduced, that is the time you can start steroids. And steroids also, you don't need to start it at very high doses. You can give it anywhere between 8 milligrams of dexamethasone to a maximum of 80 milligrams of methylprednisolone. That's probably the maximum we should do. Going more than that is not going to help. I've heard of people giving a gram of steroid, pulse doses and things like that. It's not really going to help you because to tackle inflammation, you don't need big doses. We have to manage pharyngitis and tonsillitis by very small doses of prednisolone, isn't it? So that is the kind of inflammation that is there in the body. So by giving a larger dose, you'll probably lead to secondary bacterial infection and other problems like critical illness, polyneuropathy, myopathy. And that is the reason we want to give smaller doses. But what I've done in the last couple of days, I mean, I've changed a little bit in the last month. I am not giving it for only 5 or 7 days and stopping it. I'm giving it for a very, very prolonged period. This is what I've started doing for the last almost a month and a half. I'm giving it for approximately 21 to 24 days in severely ill patients because a few patients of mine just bounced back after stopping the steroid. I mean, I went on steroids and I gave it for around 5 to 6 days. And then 7th, 8th day when I actually tapered and stopped it, they just bounced back. They just went into a very difficult situation and I had to restart steroids. This happened with me, my personal issue. I was on steroids. I was on 40 milligrams of methylprednisolone a day. And these guys, and I was doing fine. On day 7 or day 8, they actually, no, day 12 or something, day 10 or day 12, they stopped my steroids. They stopped my steroids. And, I was thinking, okay, well, fine enough. I'm going to go home in the next couple of days, This is what I felt, day 10, day 11. I thought maybe now they're stopping, they stopped my, and I was not looking after my treatment. I gave it to somebody else to look after myself. You can't look after yourself at that time. So, the doctor, there was a group of doctors looking after me. So they stopped the steroid. They stopped the steroid. The next day morning, I couldn't wake up from my bed. I couldn't just wake up from my bed. I couldn't breathe. I went back into respiratory distress. It was traumatic for me. And then I couldn't pick up the phone to call anybody. I couldn't ring the nurse's bell. I became completely down. I was breathing so heavily that I couldn't anymore go to the toilet. So for me, the first time in my life you pass urine on your bed. It's never done this. It was traumatic for me, very, very traumatic. And they came back and they gave me that pulse dose of methylprednisolone. I just turned around. The next day. Of course, my sugars went up to 700s, but I turned around. So I think they overdid the steroid because they were very scared because संजीत को हो जाएगा कुछ तो 500 डाल दे दिया उन्होंने मेरे को ऐसा कर दिया लेकिन but it did turn me around. So personal experience has been that you cannot stop steroids early in a certain category of patients, and I think that certain category of patients are the severely ill patients, not the mild to moderate cases. It has to be the severely ill. Mild to moderate may not require it, but the severely ill patients will probably require something that we used to earlier call as Meduri protocol, 21 days of steroids. So probably 21 days. So I continued my steroids till 28 days rather. I continued steroids for 28 days. Yeah, I came home and I was on steroid for almost 28 days. I got 20 kilos. Wazan बढ़ गया मेरा. So वो हुआ मेरा, but it probably helped me. In fact, when I came home and I was wanting to reduce my steroids, I was scared because that one experience made me so scared that when I came home, should I reduce my steroids 10 times? I told my wife, you must monitor me on a regular basis. This occurred, So it's traumatic, that when you face something like this. And you know what? At that time, you realize the importance of a family. I'm telling you, all you people sitting over here, मैंने कभी ऐसा सोचा नहीं था कि मैं ऐसा सब सोचेगा. But when you start getting diplopia, when you start getting that feeling that I'm going down. You start getting the feeling that I can't lift up my head. Suddenly you start feeling, where is my wife? Where is my children? Where is my parents? That all comes in front of your eyes. It's something that happened to me. And I realized all this time going at 6 o'clock and coming in the night at 8 o'clock was completely worthless. Nobody gave me a Padma Shri. Nobody increased their salary. Nothing like that happened. So please don't work excessively. Doesn't make any sense.
True.
That's
Correct.
so
True.
true.
And even steroids for mild to moderate, we are giving patients and they're continuing even after discharge, Akshay.
So, but
Yeah.
Sushma, it should not
So
be in
the
the
next
mild
question
category.
is Sanjay. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
And Sushma, again, I want to discuss that now the COVID and post recovery. Are there any special complaints, or how do we see this kind of patients coming back with any serious issues
So
again?
this is one of the most important questions. I want to answer this. I've had 4 patients who have come back after 28 days. Okay, after 28 days and gone so breathless and suddenly died. So now what I'm feeling is, that tocilizumab that we gave may cause so much of immunosuppression, or in fact to an extent of immunoparalysis, that these patients have infections. So it is not something that is acceptable. So you just can't give right, left, center steroid and tocilizumab. It's a dangerous proposition. We should not do something like that. Today I had a discussion at Jahangir Hospital where a doctor is admitted, and the interleukin 6 was 51. And interleukin, he's a nephrologist admitted in Jahangir Hospital. So 51 was the interleukin, LDH was 210. Patient didn't have swinging fever. There's a big discussion and debate saying that we should give him tocilizumab. If they give him tocilizumab, it will be dangerous. He does not have cytokine storm. So what is happening, unfortunately, is tocilizumab has become like the most important drug. People are giving it right, left, center. Patient a little bit of
There is no easy availability now. Black market and all that. It's the genuine patients are not getting it.
But it's a very dangerous drug. I would not suggest to give it without expert opinion, without asking people, without rationally giving it. It's
Correct.
you have to rationalize that drug.
No,
Yeah.
tocilizumab,
Sanjit, are
how
patients
many
following
doses
up
do you
with
give?
you?
Yeah. So in fact, I did a few CT scans of my first patients. March 8th, March 9th, we had, I think, our first cases that came to us. And we probably got the first 10 cases in our ICU of Bombay. So, so there was this group of ARDS patients that came to us, and they all did well. So I did their repeat CT scans after 3 months because I wanted to know what is going to happen to me. That was a selfish motive of mine also, because मेरे को क्या होने वाला है मेरे को देखने का था. So because I also have some ARDS picture in my lungs. So I did their CT scans, and to my surprise, 95% of them have got complete resolution. Complete resolution.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's not like fibrosis. It's not like fibrosis and respiratory cripple for life. So after seeing them, I have become happy. Yeah, maybe ठीक ही होने वाला हूँ.
Okay, and secondly, Sanjit, Sushma is telling that it is seen that after discharge or after recovery, few patients are coming back after a few weeks with some thrombotic episodes. Okay.
Yes.
So for that, are you doing any test or asking them to follow up, or are you treating them even after discharge?
So this is
Do you have any such patient?
yeah. So this is a very important question that you're asking. Okay. Now, when we define hospital associated thrombosis, we define it after discharge for 90 days. In other cases also. For example, forget COVID. Even if you're talking of a severely ill patient that is coming into intensive care, when we say hospital acquired thrombosis, it means 90 days. It means 90 days. So if you have a patient who is severely ill, critically ill, you are expecting him to be immobile for a couple of days at home also, at least for a month and a half. If you're going to expect him to be ill for a month and a half, you follow the normal VTE guidelines, which includes Clexane once a day for 1.5 months, 1.5 to 2 months. If this patient has got documented pulmonary embolism or documented DVT, then you give it for 3 months. That is what has been proven. You give it for 3 months. At 3 months, you decide whether you want to continue it or not continue it. Yes, if you do not follow it this way, for example, you have a patient who was critically ill, was on a ventilator. You are not expecting this patient to come off and start running a marathon. That is not possible. That is really not possible. He's going to be ill. He's going to be immobile. His inflammation is going to persist for a long time. And we know inflammation, stasis, and immobility is going to cause, the famous workout triad and causing venous thromboembolism. So for those patients, you probably want to give it for 2 months. Following D-dimer is not the way. Following D-dimer is definitely not the way. D-dimer is only an acute phase reactant. Some people are following D-dimers, and when the D-dimer comes low, they're stopping it. No, you give the anticoagulation because this patient was severely ill, not because the D-dimers are high.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
this you're talking for those who are in ICU and those who are hospitalized for quite a longer time, maybe critically ill patients.
Yeah.
But what about those who had shortest span of illness?
They don't require anything. They don't require anything.
Okay.
No.
No follow-up or
So-
no investigations
No.
also.
So there is Deborah from United Kingdom. She's from St. Guy's and Thomas's. Vibha was able to told you about her. Famous researcher. So she's looking after thrombosis of St. Guy's and Thomas's. So what she's now researching that whether mild to moderate cases, whether they require anticoagulation in the near future in the subset of COVID illnesses. In MERS-CoV and SARS-CoV-1, they didn't require it. They had done the study there. In MERS-CoV and SARS-CoV-1, they did not require extended prophylaxis. This is called as extended prophylaxis. When you give prophylaxis after hospital stay, it is called as extended prophylaxis. So that extended prophylaxis is not being proven for MERS or for SARS-CoV-1. So she is now investigating in SARS-CoV-2 in the subset of mild to moderate, whether you require it for a long term. And I think the interim results, which are recently she was discussed on online, doesn't seem that it is favorable to give it for a long period of time because there are no incidences of VTE there. If you look at the studies, no VT from China, they've shown VT venous thromboembolism somewhere in the range of 30 to 40%. Now, 30 to 40% in China, they have shown that is the incidence that they've shown. But if you see the latest studies, they are somewhere around 10 to 15%, which is the usual incidence.
Lesser.
Yeah, it's the usual incidence now, 10 to 15%. Chinese people, what happened to them now? They started seeing patients that were very, very ill when they were in DIC. You know, they were not seeing the earlier patients. They didn't know only what was hitting them at that time. So all their subsets of patients that we did and the investigation that did were in the late phases. That's why they said that patients get DIC. In fact, first thing what we had learned with COVID was patients go into DIC. You know, and now we say, no, it is not DIC. It is more of prothrombotic state. So when Chinese investigated it, that is what they found. Now it's very clear that it's not 40 to 50%, it's somewhere between 10 to 15% of DVT, which is the usual rate. 15% is what the usual rate is. People are getting 15 to 20%. It's just 5% more.
Okay, and you said about it is more of a hypoxia which is causing damage, right?
Yeah.
So this hypoxic damage, apart from pulmonary part, the renal part, the cerebral hypoxia or the hepatic involvement, what is your experience in it?
So we've not had, we've had single organ problem. We've never had, now at this moment, I do have a COVID patient on CRRT, but he came with a pre-renal insufficiency. He came with diarrhea. That's why he's gone into AKI induced and CRRT. But if you ask me, do they have multi-organ insufficiency? Only in the later phases. They don't have it with COVID. COVID, it's usually single organs, only single organs. And sometimes you get encephalopathy, sometimes you get it, but it's not very regular. The majority of cases have got single organ and it's only the lung. So hypoxia per se, see oxygen delivery, what you're seeing on SpO2 is just a figment of oxygen delivery. Oxygen delivery is equal to 13.4 into cardiac output into HB into SpO2. So your cardiac output, your HB, all that is factored into your SpO2, and that delivery is much higher, and it is normally to all your vital organs, which includes brain, heart, and lungs. That's why you don't see ischemia. You're not seeing ischemia. You're not seeing hypoxic brain encephalopathy. You're not seeing renal damage or ATNs. You're not seeing all those things. You're not seeing this because your delivery remains intact. Your delivery, your heart is pumping fast, heart is pumping good. Cardiac output is in the range of 6. I did cardiac output monitoring for around 7 or 8 patients, and I found the cardiac outputs to be around 6 and 7, which is normally around 4 and 4, 5, 4, 3, 6 and 7 is what we're getting. So they are in a hyper state. Their cardiac output is pumping to improve the circulation everywhere. That's how it is.
And for those patients who are already on steroids, for any, like for asthmatic patients who are on prolonged steroids or any other illness, is it having any protective or maybe a beneficial effect on this on the prognosis?
So there were 2 questions that was, last week I had a webinar, last 4 days back I had a webinar. These 2 questions very similar. One was, if the patient is on warfarin, is it protective? Warfarin also because it will prevent thrombosis. And the other one is, if the patient was on steroid, is it will be protective? No. So there are no studies that document this, but there is the Italian group that says that if the patient is on steroid, just continue the steroid. Because if you don't give the steroid, the patient will go down. So it is not protective in any way if you are on steroids, because how a patient is going to respond, we don't know. So the hyperinflammation, we know very well, is not getting controlled with even elephant doses of these steroids, and that's why we are resorting to drugs which are non-steroid based as of now. So there are no protective effects.
Sanjit,
Yeah.
somebody are using methylene blue and all this. Do
Yeah.
you
So
have an-
no, so methylene blue is something that many people are using. So this comes from sepsis actually. So in sepsis, what used to happen is when the later phase of sepsis, the oxygen delivery was so low that in the microvascular area, there is no extraction of oxygen. Since there was no extraction of oxygen, cell death, mitochondria not working, people used to try methylene blue. So they are trying the same thing with the premise that the cell is not extracting, let it extract more, but it will not work because entire thing is not based on just hypoxia, because there is an element, a large element of VQ mismatching, a large element of immunothrombosis. So unless you tackle, answer is inflammation. If you tackle inflammation, everything will be okay. Inflammation is causing the D-dimer to go up. Inflammation is causing the lung to get bad. And that is the primary reason that recovery trial showed an improvement in mortality. Recovery is the only trial till now in COVID-19 that has actually showed improvement in mortality. And the recovery trial actually just used small doses of DEXA, that's around 6 milligrams of DEXA for a period of around 9 to 10 days, and that has showed improvement in mortality. That's why targeting inflammation seems to be the right way, and NSAIDs unfortunately is not the answer. We don't know why. NSAIDs is not there. Others, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs was the simplest thing to be used, but for some reason, NSAIDs are not proving beneficial in COVID-19. That's why it's still novel and we don't know what to do.
Hey Sanjit, you've seen ILD with COVID. How do
I
they
have
do?
one patient presently, rheumatoid arthritis, ILD plus ischemic heart disease. Presently, these patients surprisingly are doing well. I don't know how. They probably are tolerating much lower levels. So she's on saturation of 84, 85. Even if I'm trying to crank it up, it's not going more than 86, 87. It's not going up only. But she's very comfortable. She's very, very comfortable. I have given her steroids, her usual steroids. I have not added increased steroids on her because she doesn't require it. But she's doing well. She's doing well. Yeah.
So, yeah, because I have this one patient, saturation 78, happy hypoxia, what you call. Same picture, no problem, no breathlessness. And surprisingly, he's walking, talking, everything. Got him admitted yesterday, but yeah, I wanted to know the prognosis for such patients.
They have comorbidities. So for very obvious reasons, comorbidities are known to have issues over here, because every comorbidity, let it be diabetes, let it be hypertension, they are all associated with inflammatory disorders. All of them. Inflammation plus COVID inflammation is hyperinflammation. Okay, so at the end of the day, once there is comorbidities, that is the reason these patients are going to die. Okay, because COVID causes an inflammation, but tolerating a very low saturation may not be a good idea, because surprisingly what happens is when there is going to be hypoxia, there is going to be a release of something called as a preceptin. This preceptin causes von Willebrand factor to increase. This causes more release of TPA, endothelial TPA coming in, and this endothelial TPA will cause more damage. So you should not accept hypoxia. You should probably give, because they are going to remain happy. They are going to remain okay. So you should give up oxygen to get them to their usual. And normally most of these lung diseases, they know their normal saturations. So if you know their normal saturations, you get them to their normal or at least 2 to 3% less than their normal. You should do that. Otherwise, you will this patient.
So do you recommend blood gas analysis?
Sorry?
Do you recommend blood gas analysis in these patients?
But this is only to diagnose. Only to diagnose the case. I mean, see, a blood gas analysis is not going to get you anywhere. It is just going to cause more pain, nothing more. The only thing a blood gas analysis does is gives you a diagnosis of ARDS. Nothing more. Nothing more. Lactates are going to remain normal. Bicarbonates are going to remain normal. The pH is going to remain normal. Only thing you're going to see is a PF ratio, the PO to FO2 ratio, which will now diagnose you into severe ARDS or moderate ARDS or mild ARDS, just for the sake of labeling it on the book. Otherwise, a blood gas is not going to give you any other information. There is no information you get from a blood gas.
So how would you go about it?
Saturations. We have saturations, and saturation is the best guide. See, the oxygen delivery equation does not have PaO2. The oxygen delivery equation always has 13.4 into Hb into cardiac output SpO2. So the SpO2 actually is more of delivery. The PaO2 is just the arterial oxygen that is there. That's all. So you don't need to stick a blood gas all the time, because if you keep doing a blood gas, all you'll do is when you really require it, you'll not be able to use it. Your arteries will get fired. So we don't do blood gases at all in our patients, apart from the first blood gas, just to categorize this patient as severe, moderate, or mild ARDS. We don't do blood gases. Yeah.
So Sanjit, what I was asking, that the criteria for intubation and starting ventilation has changed in COVID patients. So how do you now go? Means what are
So the right metric for intubation. I mean, what is the right figure for intubation? So we are not looking at respiratory rate now. Okay, we are not looking at respiratory rate. B, we are not looking at saturation. So the only metric we are looking is at effort. So if the patient has got tremendous effort, I mean, he starts flaring up his nose, flaring up his jaws, and it looks like effort, he's taking effort to breathe. That is the time we intubate. At that time, we don't look at pulse rate, we don't look at respiratory rate, we don't look at saturation, we just intubate them. So this, unfortunately, needs a trained eye. It needs a doctor very well understanding, "Arey, ye theek nahi hai karke." And
It's
then
more of subjective rather than objective.
it's not objective anymore. It's not objective. So in fact, PF ratios of 70 and 60, we keep them on high flow
High
nasal
flow.
for a long period of time. They do well. So we can't look at PF ratios. We can't look at, but obvious it is that it is only the effort. We can't even look at RR. Respiratory rate also remains 45. So we don't really look at that. Just effort. Just effort.
Good. Nice.
Yeah, great info, Sanjit.
Ah,
Your experiences.
Superb. Fantastic.
Please
Sanjit,
take care. Even
how
now,
do
go
you
slow. I would say you're coughing already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sanjit, how do you prevent? How many of your patients have had hospital-acquired infections?
So, Abhijit, I don't know whether you attended that Yatin Mehta webinar, that big microbiology webinar with Tanu Singhal and all. So there was this webinar that was conducted, and I actually presented my cases where for a long period of time, I had hardly an incidence of bacterial superadded infections, hardly an incidence. What I've done, Abhijit, is something that is not supposed to be done, frankly. But what I've done is I've put every patient that comes into an ICU into an empirical antibiotic. Every patient. Now people might scream and shout, "Arey yaar, tu aisa kar raha hai, tu increase resistance karwayega." All these things they will scream and shout. But it has helped my patients. It's definitely helped my patients because I don't have the manpower to go inside and do repeated bronchial samplings and repeated blood cultures. वो नहीं होता है मेरे से, नहीं होने वाला है वो. There is no time for all that. So what we are doing is we are giving them empirical antibiotics the moment they come in, and that's probably the reason that my bacterial infections are probably on the lower side. I will not say a cause and effect, but I'm noticing very less bacterial infections in my hospital. But in the last 20 or 20 odd days, I have had a spike, and that's probably because I was sick and people were using tocilizumab right, left, and center. So I wasn't really looking after. I looked after the patients for 4 days when I was ill. After that, I just couldn't do that. But that time, I think we started using a very high dose of tocilizumab two times for almost every hypoxic patient. That's what they started doing. And now I'm seeing this spate of bacterial infections, and I hope that this comes back. Surprisingly, I've started seeing Enterococcus faecium. I've started seeing Staph aureus, which was never there. I never had this in I've started seeing Enterococcus. I'm not seeing the usual Acinetobacter and Klebsiella. My ICU had 56% of Acinetobacter and some 46% of Klebsiella. But I'm not seeing Acinetobacter Klebsiella. I'm seeing Staph aureus and Enterococcus, which is not something I would have seen. And we normally say a viral infection usually will have a secondary bacterial infection. That is not what I'm seeing here. It is a completely different picture. And I think it's because of the tocilizumab, because it probably fires up the immunity and you get your own gut bacteria inside you. I feel so.
Yeah. Because Acinetobacter is basically it's present on the surfaces. So probably the hospital, your ICU already has a good amount of surface disinfection happening. So that therefore the Acinetobacter rate has gone down.
Yeah, I think this might be the scene in most of the hospitals, because we all are now cleaning so many times that our CEO tells us, "Why are you using so much of disinfectant?" They keep shouting and screaming at us with the number of dabbas that we're using. So I think Acinetobacter has probably gone down. Akshay, तेरे उधर कैसा है?
लेकिन उधर तो Acinetobacter नहीं, Pseudomonas वगैरह आता है actually. But secondary bacterial infection in COVID patients are very less.
Very less, yeah, very, very less. Compared to
unless they have received very high dose of Solumetrol or tocilizumab, then it is a.
But Akshay, this was not the case when we had H1N1. So in 2009, when we had H1N1, every third or fourth patient had got a secondary bacterial infection, and usually it used to be strep or staph. That's how it used to be in 2009, 2010. But here, surprisingly, this virus wants to do everything himself. Probably one-man army है वो. तो शायद वो दूसरा बैक्टीरिया को आने को नहीं देता है.
नहीं, दूसरा बैक्टीरिया are frightened.
All the focus.
आने नहीं देता, ये लोग आते नहीं है. मतलब once Sanjit enters in ICU, बाकी कोई doctors आता नहीं है,
Sanjit is calling you COVID.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Yeah. Nice
Yeah, lovely
presentation.
presentation. Actually, even I understood a lot of it.
Now I'm also scared, Sanjit, listening to your story.
अरे seriously boss, एक चीज है, कोविड आना नहीं चाहिए किसी को भी. I'll pray for all of you, कोई किसी को कोविड ना आ जाए भाई. ये बहुत
Right,
डेंजरस
yeah,
डिजीज है. बहुत मेरा
You
बच्चा था,
know, because
मैं
one
घर पे आया
one
तो
on
मेरा बच्चा बोला नाउ डैडी विल प्ले विद मी फुटबॉल. मैं बोला साला फुटबॉल क्या खेलेगा, इधर तो चलने को बांधे हैं.
because we all think, yeah, most of the times we'll be okay and we'll recover. But sometimes when you listen about these doctor stories and that, yes, they were doing fine and suddenly they, are no more,
It's
then you
very
get scared.
uncertain.
Yeah.
First 14 days तो पूरा अनसर्टेन है, पर 14 दिन गया बाद में सोचने का अभी you are recovered.
Yes, he's
Maybe it's
absolutely
still
right.
it's
So, Sushma, what Akshay says is very, very important, because what he said is a very important point. 14 days are an issue, and that every one of us should understand. Don't treat it as a normal flu. Okay, after 8th or 9th or 10th day, you might take a
cytokine
wrong
storm.
turn. Yeah, you might just go down, and then everything will go for a toss. So if you have a flu, be careful of it, diagnose it, and be very close to a hospital that will give you a bed. Because bed ही नहीं मिलता है साला, हम लोग को भी bed नहीं मिलेगा, ऐसा हालत है.
The only
But
purpose I'm
Sanjay,
working is
this
because
is
if
just a
somebody falls
practical.
sick, we should get a bed.
Yeah.
If some of us gets the COVID, then what should be first 7 days, the treatment, it's like, preventive, or is there any something like that, or it's just luck?
So there are two things that will help you. It is Babaji ka taviz and haldi, doodh wala haldi. Nothing else is going to help you. Prophylaxis
Kada.
doesn't work. Kada. Prophylaxis doesn't work. It has been clearly proven that HCQS does not work, and the doses doesn't help in pharmacodynamics at all. I mean, what prophylaxis that we are taking logically, pharmacodynamically, as per AUC, MIC curves, as per all these things, it will not work. Prophylaxis with HCQS will probably not work. It will just help your brain that you're taking something. That useless
So
small.
should we stop taking HCQ? We are taking actually.
No, I don't know. If you're taking, take it. कल जाके बंद कर दिया, मिल गया तुम मेरे पे.
So Sushma, your experience is
Even
like
I am
you
not
said
taking.
the
I have stopped
severity was
taking.
better.
No, there was this trial, na? Which trial was it? Discovery
See,
trial
we are
or
also
some
taking.
trial?
No, so
Recovery
we
or
are
discovery
also
trial was
taking. I
there.
don't know what Swapnali.
So I'm
they-
not see.
Exactly.
if
You said the severity was little lesser.
So that's why I'm asking Sanjit, the physicians who came to you, you said, so were they on HCQS
all of them.
prophylaxis?
See, I'll tell you, the physicians who came to me, all of them were on HCQ. They were on ivermectin. They were on doxy. They was on that homeopathy का कुछ तो क्या है वो?
Arsenic.
Arsenic alba. हाँ, वो सब हाथ में लेके आए थे उन्होंने. वो सब उनके हाथ में था और मेरे को बोला वो देने का. हाँ, वो सब लेके आए थे हाथ में. तो मैं बोला यार ये सब क्या है? हाँ?
डस्टबिन में डाल दिया तुमने?
मैंने वो तो इंटीमेट हो गया, वो क्या लेता था, इंटीमेट सीधा आ गया मेरे सामने होके. तो ये सब, they bought all these things. They were all on everything possible that you could take. They were on all those things. They had already taken Zincovid. They were already on vitamin C. They were on everything. I was wondering.
And nothing is protective at all.
No. The only thing is protective is your personal protective equipment, and you not talking and drinking coffee with your people. See, I made this big mistake. What I used to do was, I used to finish my work, and I used to be drenched and sweaty and tired. When you're working, you don't get tired. When you're working, you are happy to see what's happening to your patient. You're happy to see what's happening to your ventilator. You're happy to see how your patient is improving. You don't realize only when you come off doffing, and then you go to your room. That is when you realize, "Arey yaar, chale coffee peete hain." Then you call your colleagues inside. You and your colleagues want to discuss cases. You take one coffee, one colleague makes another coffee. All of us remove their masks and start drinking coffee. That is the worst thing that you can think of. That is the worst thing. Actually, social solitary distancing, it should be called. Not only social distancing, it has to be solitary, at least for doctors. We have a very, very bad habit of, chal yaar chai pee ke aate hain. That is actually wrong now. That is actually wrong. We shouldn't never do that. And I strongly feel I got it because of those habits of mine, not because of the patients, not at all because of the.
Completely agree. Many of our residents have got it this way because they were all
Yes.
together. The same thing that you're describing, without masks, sitting close by, having coffees. Also, even outside the hospital, they go together in one vehicle and things like that, or on lunch. So yes, that they have not got it from the patients, as you said rightly. and we have tracked them, and even the other technical staff, no, they've been sitting in one small room and 4 or 5 of them having lunches together, and one person has joined back from work where that is a red zone and he's got it from there. So
Yeah.
yes, I agree completely.
So
See,
what we have
I'd
done
like to
now,
add something. I'd like to
yeah,
add
please,
something
please,
here.
please, yeah.
See, now in our hospital, ours is almost 200 bedded, and we are converting it to 250 bedded dedicated COVID, whatever, what DCH, what you call it, you know? Okay, dedicated COVID hospital. So up until now, we have had almost 35 to 40 healthcare workers who have turned positive. Okay, now these include MPW or multipurpose workers, and these include nursing staff. A big chunk of these is nursing staff and fewer doctors. Now the problem we were not able to really understand, in spite of giving the best possible PPEs and everything, why these people are getting infected. So I came up with the idea of doing an RCA, or root cause analysis, for these people. Okay, and we actually, to in fact today also I completed 4 or 5 papers of RCA, in which we take the phone numbers of all those who are admitted from the billing people wherever they were admitted. We call them up, and I'll share the RCA form with you also. I don't have it right now. Tomorrow or day after, I'll share it with you guys. And we ask them questions related to which was the last posting, whether they used re-sterilized mask, or and their PP, how they doff. Did anybody see or observe them while they were doffing? And there were many other questions. And and the last 2 questions were regarding food. One is whether they were eating together, and the second question was whether they shared food with each other. So if you won't believe, a lot of them have the questions that we asked. A lot of them finally settled down with the answers that sometimes they ate food together, and sometimes they shared food with each other. And those rooms that they shared food, those rooms, they were, even if you sit outside, that is okay, but the rooms were not ventilated, proper ventilation. So therefore, at that time, your masks are down, people are sitting just across the table, and that is where they get infected. This is what the conclusion with which we have reached now.
This is what we also feel. Yeah. So what we've done now, Abhijit, have you tackled that in any way? What is the way you've tackled this now?
No, yes. Now for tackling it, what we have done is, now we have, so as per NABH, we are supposed to have 1 infection control nurse per 100 beds. Okay, so we have roughly 8 or 9 infection control nurses with us, and looking at the severity of the problem, the medical director has given us a few more nurse educators who are a bit more educated than these guys, nursing staff and all. So what we have done is, every time, either in the morning or in the afternoon time, the duties are as per rotation. When the infection control nurses, they come on duty, we put them on one duty only. That is, starting first hour of the duty is go to all over the hospital, all wards and all OPDs and everywhere, and find out how many people are having food together, and just make them get up, and just do not let them eat food together. And that has brought about an awareness in them. How much ever you teach them in the during the presentation or anything, but when you ask them to just get up when they are having food, only then they realize the importance of that. And earlier also, we tried doing all other things, like telling them, putting them extra duty and all other things, but nothing works. So finally we have decided that we just ask them to get up from that place, and ask them to eat food at some other place. And this has helped, because you cannot imagine, under the staircase where there's little space, there also 4 or 5 MPWs go inside and sit and have food and share food. And it's like there's something about eating together that they cannot just resist.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, it's like us having coffee
but
together. Yeah, for them it's
Yeah.
like having food
it's a
together.
problem everywhere. It's not
It's a
just
problem
medical
everywhere.
staff, but it's with common men also.
Agreed.
So,
Agreed.
so
Probably
In
this is
that's
our
the
the biggest
biggest
society
problem.
when they
also,
are
I
trying
can
to
tell.
Because I think
emotionally
while eating
ventilate
now, they are
themselves.
not wearing the mask. That's the
Yes,
biggest problem.
yes, of course. No, and just yesterday there is
Cannot
a
wear mask basically. So
just yesterday there's a guideline from WHO regarding transmission. So coughing, sneezing, talking, singing, including talking loudly, the respiratory droplets are released.
Right.
WHO keeps on changing, yeah.
I
Statements
don't
every now
believe
and
that
then.
body first wear mask.
हर रोज
who is
डराता
who
है
is WHO? Who is WHO?
डराता है रोज
So you know what? But in WHO, na, you should listen to Janet Davis. Janet Davis is probably the authority in WHO. So if Janet Davis released something, you should look at it because she's an authority.
Yes,
And
yes,
she
of
will,
course.
yeah. I don't think I will disregard it. See, May 28th, there was an update that came in that said that you don't need to isolate yourself for more than 10 days if you are got infected, and 3 days of asymptomatic period is enough. So I don't know why ICMR didn't just pick it up. It took so much time to pick it up, because that isolation kills you. Yeah, isolation kills you. It's my personal experience. It
Yes.
just kills you. I mean, it is very difficult to be in isolation. Yeah, it's like jail. Yeah, I mean, कितना देर तू मोबाइल देखेगा, कितना देर टीवी देखेगा. It is very very tiring. And I'll tell you, कवन से मुझे बहुत फायदा हुआ. कवन लकड़ा वाला से, अपना कवन से. मेरे को सुबह शाम फोन करता था. हाँ,
Did
सुबह
you
शाम फोन
really
करता
take
था.
his help?
हाँ. So he used to call me in the morning, call me in the
Did
evening.
you take any treatment from him?
I didn't take treatment, but he used to talk to me ना. उसका कुछ अलग तरीका है बात करने का. तो वो अलग अलग तरीके से, वो साइकेट्रिस्ट भी है, उसको पता है मैं साला डिप्रेशन में जाने वाला है. तो वो सुबह और शाम को he used to call me up and give me some counseling. It really worked. So
उसका पेपर में शायद सेक्सोलॉजिस्ट का कॉलम भी होता था पहले.
सेक्सोलॉजिस्ट का रहता था उसका, सेक्सोलॉजिस्ट. लकड़ा वाला स्पीक्स करके आता था. So he used to call up. So that makes, so that is one part of the story. Isolation kills you not because of the disease. It kills you because of you being in solitary confinement. It is scary. It is very very scary. I initially मेरे को बोला, if I will be in isolation, it's nice. I will have very long bath. I will have long time to sleep. ऐसे सब मेरे को लगा. मेरे को ऐसा लगा, अरे यार you can't imagine वो क्या हालत हो गया है. साला बात में 1 मिनट भी नहीं लगता था. फिर क्या करने का, दिन भर ऐसा हो जाता था. कितना देखेगा रे आदमी, नेटफ्लिक्स कितना देखेगा, थक जाता था यार. And at that time now you start realizing, अरे यार अगर मैं बुक में, हम लोग बुक पढ़ने को अच्छा लगता है. कोई लोग ऐसे बड़े बड़े बुक्स ऐसा किंडल पढ़ता है. ऐसे my wife and all reads a lot of books and all. तो आप when she reads book मेरे को लगता है दो चार दिन कैसे बुक पकड़ के बैठती है. तभी मेरे को रियलाइज हुआ, साला मैं अगर मेरे को भी वो हैबिट अगर होता, it would have been so nice. So reading, all these right positive habits of reading, writing, drawing, painting, ये सब काम में आता है isolation में, which none of us I think will have this. None of us will want to do this. It's a pain यार. And और मेरा एक बीच में एक दोस्त मेरे से लूडो किंग खेलने चालू कर दिया.
मम्मी अभी भी काढ़ा दे रही है.
हाँ, फिर क्या, काढ़ा तो बंद नहीं होने वाला है. मम्मी ने बोला काढ़ा
कोडिंग पीने का नहीं, प्रिस्क्राइब भी करना बंद कर दिया अभी तू.
मैं तो बंद कर दिया. कोडिंग तो किसी को दूंगा नहीं मैं.